wish we could just turn off this road.
I know. It would help. Alright. My name is Damon Polioudakis. I'm a graduate student at the University of Texas at Austin. And today I'm going to talk to you about the research project I've been working on the last 4.5 years now. So I'm working on getting my PhD, and that means about 5 more years of school after college. The good news is they at least pay me to go to school at this point, and I get to work in a lab and do research the whole day, so there's almost no class involved. And by doing research, I mean not just memorizing stuff from books or learning things people already knew. I'm trying to discover something that no one else in the world knew. Expand human knowledge. So it's really a process of discovery. I think you guys have probably already had a little bit from Greg on what it means to be a graduate student, so I won't go into it too much more in detail, but there'll be time after the talk if you want to ask me questions about graduate school or that sort of thing too. Now, as far as my actual research project and talking about that, feedback from the last class, I understood that you guys actually do know a lot of the scientific terms for the things I'm going to be talking about. I'll throw a few more of those words out there, but if you don't know one, I don't know exactly what you've learned or what you remember, so that's okay. And if you do know them, then it's good review. Now, for my actual project, I'm interested in cell growth. What makes cells grow? Now, there's a couple words up there I'm going to go into the background on a little bit. The first is just go over again what a cell actually is. The easiest way to think about a cell is that it's the smallest subunit of life. It's like the building blocks or the Legos that make up a living organism. Many living organisms are only a single building block, and then there's others like us that are made of many, many cells or building blocks. Now, are there any guesses, and just to go, if I ask you guys questions, just raise your hands or shout them out, and there'll be time at the end too. But are there any guesses as to how many cells each one of us is made up of? 1 million, billion, trillion? Yeah.
10 trillion?
That's pretty close, actually. I think that's the closest guess I've heard. We're actually, each one of us is made up of 50 trillion cells. That's just an impossibly big number for me to wrap my head around. The easiest analogy or way I can think about it is there's only 500 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy, and each one of us is made up of 50 billion cells. Now that means they have to be pretty small, and you can fit 10,000 of our cells on the head of a pin. So they're just incredibly small, and we're made up of just an unimaginably large number of them. We're also made up of many different types of cells. And I'll show you a few pictures of them here. Are there any guesses as to what kind of cell that is in that picture? Skin, bone. What is the thing in your head made out of? What do you feel with?
Neurons.
Yeah, neurons or nerve cells. Now these ones, this is actually 2 cells here, and this one might be a little bit easier. So this is 2 different kinds of cells.
Red blood cells and white blood cells?
Yeah, exactly. You know the yardstick here somewhere. Yeah. So the white thing is a white blood cell, which is involved in your immune system. Yeah.
How could scientists have come up with how many cells are in our body if they're so small? Like, how did they discover that, do you know?
Well, we can measure fairly accurately how big an individual cell is, and then just knowing the volume that average person takes up is, I'd guess, where that estimate came from. So we can figure out the volume of an individual cell, and then figure out how many of those would have to fit in something our size.
Do you know what the method is for figuring out that volume?
The what?
The method is for figuring out the volume, or?
Yeah, so we can see a cell under a microscope, and you can tell based off the magnification of the microscope and little marks actually on the viewing field how big something is you're looking at. When it gets when you start getting down inside a cell, it gets a little bit more complicated, but just a basic light microscope, you can see it and see individual cells fairly well. Once you start getting smaller than that, it gets a little bit trickier. That's a good question, though. Now, one more type of cell. This one's a little bit trickier again. So as you're looking at here is actually a whole bunch of little cells, and you can kind of see the white borders around them. What do you use to move your arms? Yeah, so that's a muscle cell. So that's actually the cross section of a muscle. So if you took a slice right through your bicep, that's what you're looking at up there. And then all those little white lines would be the connective tissue surrounding the cells. There's a few components that are common to every cell, even though we have all these different types of cells. You may have already covered some of these, but I'm just going to run through them again real quick, also because there's a lot of cool pictures of them. So here you're looking at the cell wall, that little white stuff that you saw in that cross-section of the muscle cell, so the things surrounding the cells. And this is just way zoomed in. Here you can see this kind of worm thing. This is actually the power plant of the cell. There's a whole bunch of them much farther away. Anybody remember what the name of power plant for the cell would be? Or if you've covered that yet, just to give me an idea. Starts with an M.
Mitochondria.
Yeah, mitochondria. And if you zoom way in on this worm thing, you can see the actual little power plants on the side of it that make the energy for each cell. The main thing I'm going to be talking about today is the command center of the cell. And that's the easiest way to think about that is the command center or the brain. It's in charge of everything that goes on in the cell. And anybody remember the scientific word for that?
Nucleus.
Yeah, nucleus. You guys got that one down. Now, just a couple others. Every cell has a scaffolding system to hold it together. So you can see sort of all these cables coming out of this here to give the cell structure. And lastly, every cell has a transportation system. What you're looking at here is one of those cables you just saw much closer up. And this big circle here is cargo, or a vesicle. And this little thing right here is the little motor or car that's pulling it along this cable, sort of like a highway. And to zoom in on that little motor, that's what he actually looks like. And he actually just walks along this cable and tows his cargo along. So there's thousands of those moving stuff around inside each one of your cells. That kind of covers the cell part of the research question that I've been studying in the last few years. Next thing is, what do I just mean by cell growth? Now, on the surface, first thing I think of is just cells getting bigger. You can see a little bit smaller cell here, and then a little bit larger cell here. The second component of that is how do we make new cells? And I can think of a couple different ways to go about it. So I want everybody to raise their hand. The two choices are, one, our body takes all the components of a cell and assembles new cells from those components. The other one is our cells have baby cells. So who thinks it's the first one, that our bodies assemble all the different components? We get a couple people. Who thinks it's the second one? We have baby cells. And a lot of people that didn't even raise their hand. I'll get you guys next time. So it is actually the second one. Our cells, it's closer to the second one at least, our cells actually have baby cells. What you're looking at here, and this is the main process I'm interested in, that you start out with a single large cell, and it starts to organize itself and begin to split itself in half, and slowly splits and divides into two new cells in the end. And I've just shown another picture here, a little bit bigger, where you can see where one cell is really close to splitting into two new cells. So this is the process of cell growth that I'm interested in. How do our bodies make more cells? Now, that gets to another question. And I want everybody's hand on yes or no. Who thinks yes, that our bodies are always making new cells? Who thinks our cells are usually, actually let me rephrase that, who thinks our cells are usually growing, the cells in our body? Who thinks the cells in our body are usually not growing? So it is actually the second one. Most of the time the cells in your body are not growing. All the cells aren't busy making new daughter cells or baby cells. Which seems kind of weird at first, but when you really think about it, you're not making an extra arm all the time. You're not constantly getting bigger once you're grown up. There's only actually a few spots in your body where cell growth is usually happening and is really important. And we'll go through a few of them. So, I think you guys can get a couple of the first ones. What happens when you fall down and skin your knee or cut yourself? I'm sorry, what'd you say? Yeah, that's the first thing. Your skin rips off. What happens after that?
And then it's
Yeah, it starts to scab over.
And then it starts to regrow itself.
Yeah, you start to grow new skin over wherever you cut yourself. So that's the first thing that cell growth is really important in, is just wound healing. Anytime you injure yourself, skinning your knee is a simple example, but more serious injury too, your body has to fix itself and it needs to grow new cells to repair whatever tissue is damaged or destroyed. Another one I already mentioned in some ways is development or growing up. A young animal or organism growing into the adult animal, it needs to grow bigger, it needs to develop everything into the adult version. So there's a lot of cell growth involved in development. One other I think that you guys can get to. What on your body is constantly growing? Yeah, your hair. You always have to cut it. That's cell growth as well. Your hair follicles are constantly dividing to make new hair cells. And without it, we wouldn't have Beeb's beautiful hair. Now, the other ones of these are a little bit less obvious, I think, on the surface. But cell growth is also really important in your immune system. When you get sick, all of your immune cells need to activate and divide to make the correct cells to attack that particular disease. And cell growth plays a major role in your immune system. Another spot that it's really important is your red blood cells actually take a pretty big beating when they're getting constantly pumped all throughout your body, and they wear out really, really quickly. And as a result, your body fairly consistently needs to continually make new red blood cells just because they wear out so fast. And lastly, it's really important in maintaining your digestive tract. Your digestive tract is actually another area in your body that really takes a beating and breaks down fairly fast. So you fairly consistently have to repair and maintain your digestive tract. Now, these are all basic biological processes that are going on in every animal or in every person. And they all involve cell growth, and they're all, maybe besides hair growth, very important. The reason I'm really interested in cell growth, though, is for another side of it. Does anybody have any guess what major disease would directly involve cell growth? Yeah?
Cancer and tumors.
Yeah, cancer, tumorigenesis. Cancer, when you really get down to it, is essentially uncontrolled cell growth. One of the cells in your body decides to start growing when it's not supposed to. Now you can imagine when it's so important in some places and so dangerous in other places, it's really important for your body to regulate when a cell is growing and when it's not growing. If it starts growing somewhere it's not supposed to, it can kill an animal. But if it doesn't grow in areas like your blood cells or your digestive tract when it's supposed to, that animal will also break down. Now, just to give you a couple different examples, I think you're all sort of having an idea as to human cancers, but a lot of other animals or organisms can also get cancer. What you're looking at here is essentially a cancerous growth on an oak tree, and how that came about. It's called a gall, and a wasp went in and causes that tree's cells to grow out of control to make a home for its babies. But that would be a cancerous growth, even though it's a wasp that's causing it on the tree. what you're probably all a little bit more familiar with is human cancer. So this is melanoma, or human skin cancer, cancerous growth. And just to show you a little bit more on a cellular level, so this has been colored by someone so you can actually see what's going on. But when cancer becomes particularly dangerous is when it decides to spread from its initial location. And what they found here is an actual cancerous cell that's crawling to another location in this animal's body. Now that gets me back to my basic research question, which is I'm interested in how does a cell decide to grow or not to grow? How does our body keep so many of the cells just hanging out and not growing, but some very specific ones that are actually growing? And to really understand that, we need to zoom down inside and look at what's going on inside of a cell. Now, this little diagram here circles my image of a cell, and this picture of a command center here is what I'm using to represent the nucleus. Your cell also has a lot of receptors, or I like to think of them as like satellite dishes or antennas on its outside to receive signals that your body sends to that cell. And then there's also all of the infrastructure or construction machinery, buildings, and workers that are in charge of all the different processes inside a cell. The ones I'm really interested in are the guys that are in charge of making new cells out of that cell. Now, as I said, most of the time the cells in your body aren't growing, and how your command center tells the cell to hang out and not grow is it actually sends messages out that are carried out to all those construction workers that tell them to, stay on coffee break, keep taking lunch, you guys don't need to do anything. But if you think the simplest example is when you skin your knee and your body says you need to make more skin cells on your knee. And your body then sends signals to those cells where you've been injured, and those signals are relayed from the outside of the cell into the command center. And the command center then changes those messages that it's sending out to the construction workers and starts sending out new messages through the mail that are telling that cell to start, all those guys to fire up the machines, we need to make more cells. So then those guys go back to work, start building new cells, and that cell goes through that process I showed you to grow bigger and then divide and split into two new cells. Now, just to throw a couple more of the sciencey terms at you, which I don't know if you've covered or not. We've talked about how the command center is actually the nucleus, and inside that nucleus is the DNA. And the DNA is where the messages are actually copied and sent out to the construction workers. All of this is well and good. It's kind of easy to understand when you see it this big. But I need to go back to the point that I'm trying to understand this in something that's incredibly small. This is getting down to the size where we can't easily see with a microscope. We can see a cell and kind of the big things going on, but when we're looking at just the little mailman carrying around the messages, that's pretty tough for us just to see visually, even with a really good microscope. The next thing that makes this really complicated is the command center in your cell can send out about 24,000 different messages. Those each correspond to one of the genes in a human person. Which gets me back to, this is really easy to understand on this scale, but when you've got something that small and that many different things it can say, it gets a lot more complicated to understand pretty quickly. And to make it even a step more complicated, what my research is actually focused on is a special kind of message. And this special kind of message is called a microRNA. Which, micro essentially means small, so it's a small message. And what these small messages do is I just showed you how command center is usually sending out all those different messages through the mail. And I don't know, how many of you last sent a letter or something through the mail? Now we have email and everything, but does anyone remember how long it takes to deliver something through the mail? Yeah.
Like, it depends on where you're sending it to.
That's true. Across the country.
Probably a week or something.
Yeah, that sounds somewhere around that, right? And that's a little while. That's a time lag. And it's sort of the same for the Cell's command center. When they send those messages out, if something goes wrong and they need to change what they just told all the guys to do, they have a pretty big time lag. Not like an actual week, but they have to wait for that message to get delivered. Now, it would be a lot faster if they could just stop that message from being delivered. Say they thought they wanted to make new cells, but they changed their mind. Rather than send out another message that says, to all the guys that says, stop working, they can use a microRNA, which is this special kind of message. And what this microRNA does is it goes out and just finds all of the mailmen that are carrying that message and tells them not to deliver it. Which is a little bit weird at first, and it gets more complicated when you have to add in 10,000 more of these special kind of messages, 1,000 more of these special kind of messages that I have to account for. And those 1,000 different messages are all talking to those 24,000 messages that the mailmen are carrying. Now, I hinted a little bit that they're really fast, but that's one of the first things about a microRNA. But the other thing is a microRNA doesn't just find one specific mailman. The microRNA, a single one of those 1 of 1,000 microRNAs actually talks to many, many different mailmen. This means that if the cell is telling, all the foremen, the construction workers, the guys driving the bulldozers, the guys that are pouring the cement that are trying to make a new cell, it doesn't have to send out a special message to each one of those guys. It can send out one of these microRNAs and it'll stop all of those particular kinds of messages going out. That's just another illustration of it. The second thing I already talked about is they're much faster. You can intercept these messages in the mail rather than having to send out a whole fresh batch of letters to everybody. Another way to sort of think about it is it's really like a new sort of language that myself and other scientists are trying to decipher. We've got a pretty good understanding, a better understanding of those 24,000, 25,000 normal messages a cell's command center can send out, but we only actually discovered these things were important in humans about 10 or 15 years ago, which is really, really recently as far as scientific progress goes. So it is sort of a new frontier as far as science is concerned. And finally, I'm most interested in them because they have a lot of potential as cancer medicine. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on here. Now, the next question is, how do I study all these things in something that's so small, and there's so many of them? An easy way to think about this as far as size is, how many of you have been to the Frank Irwin Center? Not necessarily for a basketball game, but just in size, so you kind of have an idea how big it is. Well, there's about 12 to 14,000 people that can fit inside the Frank Irwin Center. If you took two of the Frank Irwin Centers, then you'd be up to about 24 to 26,000, which is how many people I'm trying to understand what are saying inside of a cell. So take two of these, shrink them down really, really, really small, and then I'm trying to pick out a few guys in here that are actually saying something to all of the guys that are involved in making cells grow. The way I go about actually studying that is using something called a microarray. Now, again, a kind of a funny word, but if you break it down, it makes a little bit more sense. Micro just means small, and when I think of array, I think of all the satellite dishes out in the desert trying to detect signals. And that essentially is what this is, but just much, much smaller. So all these satellite dishes are trying to detect radio signals and things from outer space. I'm trying to detect all the little signals and messages that are going on inside of a cell. Now, you can see this scientist here holding up a little glass slide, and that is actually the microarray. I'd like to think I look like that much of a scientist when I hold mine up when I'm looking at them, but I think I'm still working on it. So I brought one of them in, and I've used it, so you can't mess it up. I'm going to pass it around. It's not worth anything to me, but it is glass, so try not to drop it because I'm going to have to clean up glass. And I don't think you'll actually be able to see any of the little sort of satellite dishes on it, but I just want to give you a sense as to the actual size of these things. Now, the next picture I have up on here is actually a really, really blown up or zoomed in picture of this little glass slide. And it's black because it's in the dark, so you can see all these little sort of like yellow dust or fluorescent yellow colors on it. And if I zoom in on that even farther, you can see all those little yellow dots are in fact mostly yellow, but there's also some green and some red dots in there. So this is just way, way zoomed in on this little glass slide, or this microarray. And how this thing works is each one of these little spots detects one of those messages that a cell's nucleus or its command center can send out. And the way I actually use this thing is I go in and I take a population of cells and I collect all the little messages out of those cells. I take all of those little messages being carried by the mailman and I put them on this microarray that has all the little satellite dishes to detect those messages. And how I actually interpret it is, again, you can't really see it on this whole, where I'm trying to show the whole thing here, but if you zoom way in, you can see that there's the green and the red dots and the yellow dots. And each one of these dots corresponds to one of the different 24,000 messages a cell can send out. So how I interpret it is if that message lights up green, then that means that that message is involved in making a cell grow. If it lights up red, that message is telling a cell not to grow. And then you can see most of them light up yellow, and that means that message isn't involved in telling a cell to grow or not to grow. Which makes sense when you think about it. There's many, many other processes that your cell needs to control or is working on, and only a few of the messages it sends out then are going to be involved in cell growth. Now, just to go back to my actual project and wrap things up here, what I've learned in the time I've spent studying these microRNAs and cell growth is I've discovered, so no one knew about these before I did, 4 more of these microRNAs that are involved in making cells grow, that make cells not grow, and then 1 microRNA that makes cells grow. Now, why this is important and why people care about this, besides just understanding on a basic level how our body works or how our cells work, is that, where we go? They play a large role in cancer. So first of all, many of these microRNAs have been shown to be disrupted in cancers, and a lot of them have been shown to control cell growth. And in fact, there's multiple clinical trials now, so people are trying to develop medicines that are based off of using these microRNAs. The farthest one along is actually in stage 3 now, so that's the stage right before it would be available for everybody to use as a medicine. So they have a lot of potential as a cancer medicine, as well as working in a number of other diseases. The last component of my research that I've really been working on is I don't want to just know which of these microRNAs are involved in cell growth, but I want to know which of the messages or mailmen they actually talk to. So that's the last component of this. And as you saw, that adds those numbers add up quickly. So I've discovered hundreds of these messages or mailmen that these microRNAs actually go in and talk to. Now, that wraps up my talk. Thank you all for listening and answering the questions so well. I've got time now at the end for any more questions on this specifically. Cancer in general is fine, or if you're curious sort of what it means to even be a grad student or go to grad school, any of that's fine too. Yeah?
What kind of cells do you specifically work with?
They're called fibroblasts, and they're the little connective cells in between your skin cells. They're sort of one of the types of scaffolding cells in your body. And the reason we work with them is it's actually really, really difficult to make cells grow when they're not inside your body. I work in little culture plates on them, and they're one type of cell that we can, in fact, grow outside of your body. It's really, yeah.
After you finish grad school, are you gonna go into medicine making? Or like what field of work are you gonna go into?
Yeah, medicine making would be a good way to think about it. Work for a biotech company, and that could either be drug development or developing diagnostic tools to detect when someone's getting sick. It's actually really hard for us even to detect cancer until it's too late right now. Another direction could be working with a biofuels company to develop organic fuels, alternatives to drilling oil and gasoline. But yeah, some sort of biotech company. Yeah.
When you say that the yellow dots represent cells or messages that have nothing to do with cell growth, what are usually those messages have to do with? Like,
All sorts of different things. One could be how much energy your cell is making, so how hard the mitochondria is working. There's many that are involved in if your cell becomes infected with a virus or is being attacked by a bacteria, so in the immune system.
sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. But yeah, many different processes like that. Anything that your body needs to live or survive. Repairing the cell itself rather than making new cells. Yeah, anything else? Alright, well thank you all for paying attention.
Okay, so I'm gonna switch you guys the